The eggs sold out in 47 minutes. I know because I was standing at the tailgate of my grandfather's 2003 Ford F-250, the one with the cracked dashboard and the passenger mirror held on with electrical tape, watching a line of people I had never seen before stretch from the Millard County Farmers Market booth all the way back past the kettle corn stand. 47 minutes. I checked my phone when the last carton left my hands, and then I just stood there in the October cold with an empty truck bed and a cash box I didn't know how to hold. 2 months before that morning, a man named Gerald Fitch had laughed at me in front of 6 other people. He was my nearest neighbor, with 340 acres of corn ground running right up against the eastern fence line of the farm my grandfather left me. He was 61 years old, sunburned in the permanent way that is less about summer and more about a lifetime, and he had a way of looking at me, at my hands, at my boots, at the single braid I hadn't had time to redo in 3 days, that made me feel like a word he had already decided was spelled wrong. It was a Tuesday morning in the second week of August. I had come out to the run at 6:15 to scatter the morning feed, and I was using grain from a bin my grandfather had sealed and labeled in handwriting I was still learning to read. The label said, Bloody Butcher Hickory King '09 mix for the girls only. I didn't know what that meant yet. I only knew the chickens went quiet when I opened that bin, the way they went quiet before nothing else. Gerald had come over to discuss the fence line or to stand near the fence line and suggest, for the 4th time since June, that a young woman on 83 acres with no livestock experience and a mortgage that was 2 months from its first renegotiation date might want to think seriously about a conversation with the right buyer. He said, right buyer. The way people say, good doctor, when they already have someone in mind. His 2 farmhands were with him. 3 men from the co-op had pulled in behind his truck. They all watched me scatter that grain from the old bin. Gerald said something. I didn't hear all of it. What I heard was the laughter, not cruel, exactly which almost made it worse. It was the laughter of people watching someone young do something old without understanding what they were doing. I kept scattering the grain. The chickens, 22 Rhode Island Reds and 4 Dominiques that had been my grandfather's from the beginning, moved to the feed with a focus that felt, even then, like something worth paying attention to. I closed the bin lid and walked back to the house without answering Gerald at all. That evening I went back to the bin. I hadn't planned to. I'd told myself I was going out to check the water line on the east coop, which needed a new washer and had needed one since August. But I walked past the coop without stopping and ended up standing in front of the old granary with my flashlight, the kind of flashlight that's heavier than it needs to be and throws a yellow circle that makes everything look older than it is. The bin was a cylindrical galvanized steel thing, maybe 5 feet across, standing apart from the main granary in the way that structures get separated when someone builds around them over decades rather than tearing out and starting clean. My grandfather had welded a new base plate onto it sometime in the 1990s. I could see where the old metal ended and the newer weld began a seam like a water line. The lid had a simple latch, the kind you can work with one hand. I'd unlatched it that morning without thinking. Now I stood there and actually looked at it. The grain inside was not corn, it was not wheat. It was not anything I recognized from the feed catalogs or from the sacks stacked along the south wall of the granary. Those were straightforward, labeled modern. This was smaller than wheat berries and darker, almost reddish brown in the flashlight beam, with a hull that looked almost furry up close, and a smell that was not unpleasant but was absolutely distinct from anything else on the property. Dry, slightly sweet, with something underneath that I couldn't name. Earthy in a way that wasn't the same as dirt. I reached in and took a small handful and held it under the light. The bin was more than half full. That was what I hadn't absorbed that morning, between Gerald's voice and the laughter and keeping my face arranged. More than half full. This thing had been sitting here, sealed, for however long it had been sitting here, and it was more than half full of grain I didn't recognize that had cost my grandfather something, his time, his attention, and whatever he'd paid to fill it. My grandfather did not waste bins. He did not waste anything that could be measured in bushels or board feet. I had watched him save the last inch of baling wire off a spool rather than start a new one, Whatever this was, it was here deliberately. The bin wasn't an accident, and the grain wasn't leftovers. I took a small amount, maybe a quarter cup, held in a fold of my flannel, and carried it to the house. I set it on the kitchen table, under the overhead light, and found my grandfather's field notebook, the spiral one with the water-stained cover that I'd taken from his desk drawer the week after the funeral. I'd read parts of it, but not all. There were sections I hadn't understood. I opened it to the beginning and started again. The notebook had been his working document for something like 40 years. The early pages were practical: feed weights, molt cycles, the date he'd wormed the sheep in 1987, a sketch of a drainage ditch he'd planned and never dug. His handwriting in those sections was confident and tight, the way a man writes when he expects to refer back to it. But somewhere around 1994, the character of the writing shifted. The entries got longer, less list, more thought. He was working something out on paper the way you do when you can't talk to anyone about it yet. I found the first mention of the grain on a Tuesday in March of 1997. He'd written it without ceremony, sandwiched between a note about a cracked water line and a reminder to call someone whose name had been crossed out. Asked R. Hensley about the emmer. He says nobody grows it anymore. Says there's no market. I told him I wasn't growing it for a market. Emmer. I didn't know the word. I said it out loud in the empty kitchen. Emmer. And it meant nothing to me. I wrote it in my own notebook. The one I'd started keeping in September, when I'd first arrived and understood how much I didn't know. I kept reading. He mentions it again 6 pages later in May of the same year. Third week of emmer. Hens on the experimental ration are laying longer into the evening. Shells harder will keep notes. Then in July, confirmed. The difference is not imagined. Spoke to no one about this yet. Want a full season first. I sat back in the chair. The overhead light was humming faintly the way it always did after 10 o'clock. Outside, the hens were quiet. They'd been quiet and steady since I'd arrived. Not spectacular, just reliable. 12 eggs most mornings from 14 birds, which I'd thought was simply what chickens did, until Gerald had stood at the fence in October and told me, with that particular flatness he used when he was trying to sound neutral, that his flock was running 17 from 14, and maybe I should consider a different feed program. I hadn't said anything. I'd nodded and gone back to the barn. 17 from 14. I'd filed that away and felt the gap between his number and mine like a small, persistent pressure behind the eye. Now I was looking at my grandfather's handwriting from 26 years ago, describing the same thing. Harder shells, longer laying, and a deliberate silence. Spoke to no one about this yet. From a man who was not secretive by nature. He'd kept this quiet on purpose, and I was only now beginning to understand that the bin in the third bay wasn't storage. It was a kept thing, a thing he'd been protecting. I turned to the next page to find out what else he'd learned that summer and what had made him stop writing about it so abruptly by October. The next page started on a Tuesday in late August. He'd been tracking the grain for 6 weeks by then, measuring it out in a coffee can he'd labeled with a strip of masking tape. 2 scoops a.m., 1 p.m. and logging the daily count in a column on the right margin. I ran my finger down the numbers 13, 14, 14, 13, 15. The 15s started appearing in early August and stayed. By the third week, they were mostly 15s and 16s, 117 penciled in with a small circle around it, like he hadn't trusted himself not to forget it. But it was the notes in the left margin that slowed me down. Shorter lines written at a different angle, added later, maybe, when he came back to the page. Shells, no cracks in the drop bucket 3 days running. Then lower. Mabel's bad layer back in rotation. Then, almost at the bottom corner where the margin narrowed. Cost per dozen dropping, don't say anything yet. I sat with that for a moment. The lantern was throwing a yellow circle across the workbench, and the September wind was doing something to the loose. Board on the north wall, a low rhythmic knocking that I'd been meaning to fix since July. Don't say anything yet, not. Spoke to no one about this. That had been protective, careful. This was strategic. He was watching the numbers change and consciously deciding to wait before he said a word to anyone. I understood that instinct. I'd felt it myself that spring when the first pullet started laying earlier than Denny at the feed store had told me to expect. 4 days earlier, which shouldn't have mattered, but it did to me, quietly. I hadn't mentioned it. You learn fast in a small county that what you say at the co-op on a Tuesday is a different version of itself by Friday. The entry for the following week was longer. He'd started noting the weight of the eggs in addition to the count. Using a small postal scale, I still had that scale. It was on the shelf above the chest freezer in the mudroom. I'd assumed it was for packages. He'd established a baseline from the first 2 weeks before the grain change, and he was now comparing against it. The numbers had shifted. Not dramatically, but consistently. Heavier by about 4% on average, he wrote, which he acknowledged meant almost nothing on its own, except that it doesn't vary every week the same direction. He'd underlined, every week the same direction, twice. Then the entry ended mid-thought, a sentence unfinished. The question is whether the mix holds through winter when the... And the next page was blank. I turned 2 more pages, still blank. I checked the binding to make sure I hadn't skipped anything. I hadn't. He'd simply stopped writing in September, and I needed to know why. I set the notebook down on the workbench and stood there for a moment in the cold of the barn. He'd stopped in September, and I knew without checking that it would have been September of 2009, because that was when he'd had the first stroke, the small one, the one the family called a warning, the one nobody talked about because he'd walked out of the hospital after 4 days and climbed onto the tractor the following Monday. My grandmother had told me that story not as a tribute to his stubbornness, but as an explanation for why she'd started keeping her own notes after. That I hadn't known she kept notes. I went back to the house. Her things were in the cedar chest at the foot of the bed in the spare room. The room that had been their room and was now just the room where I slept without feeling like I belonged in it. I'd opened the chest when I first arrived in March, done a quick inventory, felt like I was trespassing, and closed it. I hadn't opened it since. Now I lifted the lid and set it back against the wall and looked, folded quilts on top, a tin of buttons, a small Bible with her name written inside the front cover in handwriting I recognized from birthday cards. Beneath that, a cloth-covered journal, green, the fabric worn thin at the corners, and beneath the journal a manila envelope unsealed, with a rubber band around it that had dried and cracked. I took both. The journal was hers, her handwriting on the first page, a date in October 2009, which meant she'd started about a month after he stopped. The first entry was brief, practical, the way she did everything. Harold can't manage the records right now. I'll keep them until he can again. That was all she wrote about his condition. The rest of the entry was the egg count, the weight from the postal scale, the feed composition, written in her smaller, neater hand. She'd continued his experiment without missing a week. I sat down on the floor next to the cedar chest, which is not something I normally do, and I turned pages. She'd kept the same format he used, count, weight, date, but she'd added a column he hadn't kept, price per dozen at the Harlan feed store, and a separate price she'd written with a small asterisk next to it that I didn't understand yet. The asterisk appeared first in November 2009. It appeared every week after that, through winter, through the following spring, through summer, with a number beside it that was always higher than the feed store price. I opened the manila envelope. Inside were 31 checks, paper clipped together, each one made out to her, each one from a different name. The amounts were small, $8, $9, $12, but they were dated across 4 years. Someone had to been buying her eggs privately, at a premium, and she had never mentioned it to anyone. I counted the checks twice, 31. The earliest was dated November 14, 2009, and the last was April 3, 2013, 11 days before she died. The names on them were a roster of people I half recognized. A surname from the hardware store in Harlan, a woman whose first name matched the woman who used to bring casseroles to the church potluck, a man whose last name was the same as the family that ran the orchard on Route 9. None of them had ever come to the house while I was visiting. None of them had ever been mentioned in the same breath as eggs. I laid the checks out on the cellar floor in 4 rows by year. The amounts had climbed. The 2009 checks averaged $8.50 a dozen. By 2012, the average was 14. The last check written in April 2013, was for $18. The feed store price she'd noted in the ledger for that same week was $4.20. She had been selling eggs at more than 4 times market rate privately, to a list of customers who had apparently sought her out and kept coming back for 4 years, and she had told no one. I tried to think of a reason she would keep this quiet. She wasn't the kind of woman who hid money. I had known her to leave the winter fuel bill on the kitchen table for anyone to read, had known her to talk plainly about what the farm cost and what it brought in. Modesty seemed wrong too. She wasn't falsely modest. She was direct in the way that people who've worked land their whole lives are direct, without performance in either direction. The only thing I could think of was that she didn't want the questions, because if you tell someone your eggs sell for $18 a dozen, they ask why. And if you say it's the grain, they ask what grain. And if you say it's a grain from an old canvas bag your husband found in the back of the barn before he got sick, they look at you the way people look at someone who is very old and possibly confused about what is real. I understood that. I had gotten that look twice already this week, once from the bank officer on Tuesday, and once from the neighbor who had offered to help me sort through things, with a tone that meant he wanted to know what I intended to do with the Fleep acreage. I put the checks back in the envelope. I put the envelope back in the cedar chest next to the ledger. I left the cellar the way I found it and stood in the kitchen for a long minute with the light coming through the east window at the low angle it takes in early March, throwing a pale stripe across the linoleum. Then I went to find the grain bag. The bag was where I had left it, hanging from a nail on the east wall of the small barn, the one my grandfather had built as a secondary feed storage in 1961, according to the date he had scratched into the concrete threshold with a nail. The bag itself was canvas, olive green faded almost to gray, with a drawstring top that someone had knotted twice and then a third time for good measure. It weighed about 11 pounds. I had weighed it on the kitchen scale the first time I found it, 11 pounds, 4 ounces, and I had not taken much from it since, rationing it out in small handfuls mixed into the regular scratch grain, because I didn't know how much there was to begin with or where to get more. I lifted it off the nail and carried it to the work table near the door where the light was better. The grain inside was unlike anything I had seen at Halverson Feed and Supply in town, which was where I bought the standard layer pellets and the cracked corn. This was whole grain, small, dense kernels, darker than wheat, with a faint reddish cast that made me think of dried blood in the way that farm things sometimes look like other things you'd rather not think about. There were seeds mixed through it that I couldn't name, long, flat ones, tiny round ones the color of old mustard. When I pressed a pinch of it between my fingers, it left a slight oil on my skin, almost waxy, and smelled faintly of something I could only describe as both old and alive at the same time, the way a root cellar smells in October, or a wool coat that has been in a cedar chest since before you were born. I had sent a photograph of it to the extension office at the County Agricultural College in February. A woman there had emailed back 12 days later to say she wasn't certain, but it looked like it might be a heritage grain blend, possibly including emmer wheat and a variety of millet that was not in common commercial production. And would I be able to bring a sample in person? I had not gone yet. I wasn't sure I wanted anyone else to identify it before I understood it myself. The hens went quiet when I approached the run, which was their habit, 17 of them, a mix of breeds my grandmother had apparently selected over years for reasons I was still working out. They would rush me at the gate, then stop 2 feet away and stand there watching, making the low sound that isn't quite clucking. More like thinking out loud. I measured out a 1/4 cup of the grain into the palm of my left hand. The oldest hen, the broad Dominique with the cloudy left eye, stepped forward first the way she always did, and I thought, whatever is in this? She knew it before I did. She ate from my palm with the same focused deliberateness she brought to everything. No scrambling. No competitive sideways stepping the way the younger hens did. Just her beak, precise as a needle, taking 1 grain at a time. I watched the others wait. That was the thing I had started noticing around the 3rd week of feeding them this grain. The hierarchy had changed, or maybe sharpened. Before the Baird Rock, a big aggressive bird I'd privately named Sergeant had run the yard. She'd been the first to the gate, the first to the feeder, the first to drive off anything smaller. But after the grain she stood back. Not because she was sick. Her comb was bright, her eyes clear, she simply waited. They all waited for the old Dominique now, and I did not know what to make of that. I filled a second quarter cup and let the rest come forward. March had come in cold and stayed cold. The kind of damp Schuyler County cold that gets into the boards of a building and doesn't leave until May. The run was muddy along the north fence where the drainage had never been fixed, and I had laid down a fresh bed of straw the day before. They had already worked it into the mud, which was their nature. I didn't fight it anymore. I had learned to think of the things they destroyed as things that needed to show me where the real problems were. The egg count had climbed again. In the third week of February, I had 16 hens laying. One was still on a late molt, and I had averaged 11 eggs a day through most of the previous autumn. Now I was pulling 14, sometimes 15. The shells were harder. I had cracked one by accident against the edge of the basket, pressing too firmly, and instead of the clean fracture I was used to, it had compressed and splintered. I'd stood there looking at it for a moment before I understood what I was seeing. I had started keeping a notebook, my own, a new one, not my grandmother's, where I recorded the daily count, the weather, the amount of grain I mixed in and in what ratio. I was doing it the way she had done it, I realized, the same narrow handwriting columns. I didn't do that on purpose. It was just the way that made sense when I stood in the barn with a pencil. I had also, without quite deciding to, started telling people. Not many. Mrs. Calloway at the feed store on Route 13, who had known my grandmother and who had the patience to listen without offering advice. And the woman 2 farms south, whose grandmother had apparently gotten pullets from my grandmother sometime in the 1980s, and who had knocked on my door one Tuesday with a dozen of her own eggs wrapped in a dish towel, wanting to compare. She had looked at mine a long time before she said anything. Her name was Donna Pelchat, and she was 63 years old and had been farming the same 31 acres her whole life. She held one of my eggs up toward the window. It was a Tuesday in late October, weak afternoon light coming in flat and gray, and she turned it slowly, the way you might turn a stone you found in a creek bed and weren't sure yet what it was. She said it was heavier than it should be. I told her I thought that was the grain. She asked which grain, and I explained about the acorn, about my grandmother's notebook, about the 2-to-1 ratio I'd settled on after 6 weeks of adjustments. Donna set the egg down on the dish towel and looked at me, not skeptically, more the way someone looks when they're trying to place a face they know they recognize. She said her grandmother had talked about a grain, something the old families kept before the war. She had thought it was just old woman talk. I showed her the notebook the following Saturday. She sat at my kitchen table with it for almost 40 minutes without saying much. I made coffee and stood at the counter and let her read. There was a passage near the back. I'd noticed it but hadn't known what to make of it, where my grandmother had written down a name, a county extension agent from 1971, and a note that said he'd told her the grain wasn't worth the trouble because the yield per acre was too low to scale. My grandmother had written underneath it in her tight, careful hand. He was thinking about selling. I was thinking about eating. Donna looked up when she got to that part. She said, "That sounds like her." I asked if she had known my grandmother well. She said well enough to know she didn't change her mind because someone used the word yield. We cracked 2 of my eggs and 2 of hers side by side in separate bowls just to look. The difference wasn't dramatic. It wasn't like a commercial you'd film to sell something, but my yolks sat higher, noticeably once you were looking, and the color was deeper, more orange than yellow, the kind of color you associate with something that has been eating the right things. Donna was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How many dozen a week are you getting?" I told her. At that point, it was still modest. The flock was young. The grain transition had taken time, and I wasn't at full production. But the number was climbing, every week a little higher. The shells were thickening, the breakage was dropping, and I had started to wonder, quietly and without wanting to get ahead of myself, what I was going to do when the supply outgrew who I was already selling to. Donna didn't answer right away. She picked up one of my eggs, still in the shell, before we'd cracked it, and turned it in her fingers the way you'd turn something you were. Considering buying at an estate sale, set it down, picked up one of hers. She was a careful woman, not given to quick statements, and I had learned in the short weeks I'd known her that the silence before she spoke was usually worth waiting through. She said she sold to the co-op, same as everyone in the county, and that the co-op paid by volume. Cents per dozen, flat rate, no premium for quality, no incentive to feed differently or rotate pasture, or think about what a bird ate in winter versus what she needed in spring. She had been doing it that way for 11 years because that was how it was done. And she hadn't seen a reason to change something that was working. I didn't say anything. She looked at the 2 yolks in the bowls again, then she said, "Where are you selling?" I told her. A few families I'd met through the feed store. A woman at the farmer's market who had passed my name to 2 of her neighbors. One restaurant in town, the small one on Callaway Street, not the chain place near the highway, that had reached out after someone mentioned my eggs to the owner. It was informal, all of it, nothing was written down. I was charging $2 more per dozen than the co-op rate, and every single person had paid it without blinking. Donna was quiet again. Then she said, "My hens are healthy." I said I could see that. She said, "I'm not saying there's something wrong with what I'm doing." I said I wasn't either. She looked out the window toward my south pasture, where the hens were moving through the grass in the slow, unhurried way they did in late afternoon when the temperature had come down and the light was going flat and golden. She watched them for a moment, the way people watch something they are deciding about. Then she asked if I still had any of the rye seed left, the Abruzzi specifically, and whether I had planted a winter stand yet or was sourcing it. All as harvested grain, I told her I had seed. I had planted a small stand in September as a trial, following the notebook's instructions almost exactly, and it had germinated well. I had more seed than I needed for my own acreage. She nodded once. She didn't ask anything else that afternoon, and I didn't push. But when she left, she paused at her truck and said she might want to talk more about this in a week or 2. She said it the way a person says something they've already decided. 2 weeks passed before she came back, and in that time, 3 other things happened that I hadn't expected. The first was a call from the feed store in Millhaven, the one on Route 9, where I'd been buying scratch grain since August. The man who ran it, who had looked past me to the customer behind me the first time I walked in alone, called to ask if I had any of the Abruzzi rye available for sale as seed stock. He didn't say where he'd heard about it. He quoted me a price that was nearly 4 times what I'd paid per pound at the mill auction in Harwick. I told him I'd think about it and called him back the next morning to say yes, I had some available. I did not tell him how much. The second thing was a message from the woman who ran the farmer's market in Colton Township, the Saturday market in the Grange Hall parking lot, where I'd started selling eggs in October. She wanted to know if I could do a featured table in December, a write-up in their newsletter, something about heritage grain and pastured birds. She used the phrase story behind the eggs. I had never thought of it as a story. I had thought of it as following instructions left by a woman I'd never met in a notebook that smelled like cedar and old flower. The third thing was a single voicemail from the man at First Harwick Savings, the one who had sat across the desk from me in September and explained, patiently, that diversifying into specialty grain production was a high-risk move for a farm with my debt profile. He wanted to schedule a review meeting. He didn't say why. His voice had a different quality than it had 3 months earlier, though I couldn't have named exactly what had changed in it. When the woman from Dellinger County Extension came back, she brought a colleague, a younger man who studied small grain variety trials and who took photographs of my winter rye stand for 20 minutes. Without saying much, she asked me careful questions about the notebook, who wrote it, when, what else was in it. I told her about the germination notes, the soil observations, the hand-drawn diagrams of rotation sequences. She asked if I would be willing to share it, not give it, share it, for a research project she was putting together on heritage grain cultivation, practices in the Mid-Atlantic and Appalachian regions. I said I'd think about it. She smiled at that. It was the same smile I imagined I'd given the feed store man the day before. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with the notebook open in front of me and the winter dark pressing flat against the windows, and I tried to understand what had shifted. What had shifted was not the eggs, and it was not the grain. It was not the notebook, not the extension office, not the banker's softer voice on the phone. Those were effects. What had shifted was something earlier and quieter, a decision made in a February mud season when I chose to trust a dead man's handwriting over a living man's condescension. My grandfather had been gone 11 years by then. He never saw me run this farm. He never saw me struggle with the fence posts, or lose sleep over the feed bill, or stand in a cold barn at 2 in the morning trying to coax a first-time layer through the fear of her own body. He wrote that notebook for himself. I think a private accounting of what he noticed and what he suspected and what he wanted to try if he ever had time. He ran out of time. I had time. That's the whole story, really. I told the extension woman yes the following week. I would share the notebook. She made a careful digital copy, every page, every diagram, and she returned the original to me wrapped in acid-free tissue paper. It's in the house now, in a cedar box on the shelf above the kitchen window, next to the jar of emmer wheat I keep there, like it's a photograph of someone I loved. The bank review meeting happened on a Thursday in late February. I brought my records, all of them, handwritten in my own notebook. The one I started the same week I found his. The loan officer sat across from me and went through the pages with a different posture than he'd had in October. He approved the operating extension I needed for spring without making me wait. He shook my hand when I left. I drove home on the county road with the windows down even though it was 34 degrees because I needed the cold air on my face. By April, I had 43 hens laying at a rate that made the feed store manager stop mid-sentence when I gave him the numbers. I didn't gloat. There's nothing to gloat about. The land did what land does when you listen to it. The birds did what birds do when they eat what they were built to eat. I just happened to open the right drawer. If you have an old place, an old barn, an attic you haven't been through, a box someone handed you at a funeral and you haven't opened yet, open it. Not because there's treasure in it, because someone put their life's knowledge in there and ran out of time to use it, and you still have time. Subscribe if you want to follow what comes next. And if something's waiting in your own walls, I'd like to hear about it.